People come to me all the time and say, Adya, I'm awake, but. And of course, as soon as they say but, what I know as a teacher is that in that moment, they're not awake. They may have had a moment where they broke through the confines of duality and perceived truth. That's possible. But as soon as someone says, I'm awake, but, I know in that moment they're not awake. And all that's relevant in terms of awakening is right here and right now. The question isn't, have I had an awakening? The question is awakening awake right here and right now? Now, when someone comes to me and says, Adya, I had an awakening, the first thing I want to clarify that with that person is I want to see if their mind hasn't already co-opted the awakening. Because if they're saying I as an ego, as a me, had an awakening, that's just another illusion. If it's a true awakening, what we know is that it's not the me that awoken. Awakeness woke up from the me. Spirit woke up from its identification with ego. The ego does not awaken. The me does not awaken. We are not the ego. We are not the me. We are that which is awake to the ego. We are that which is awake to the me. We are that which is awake to the world. And we are the whole world as well, when seen from the true perspective. So first, as a teacher, I always want to see, is someone claiming awakening from the standpoint of an ego? Do they really believe I as a me has awoken? Of course, in conventional language, we use terms like I and me, so it's perfectly fine to use those kind of words. But nonetheless, that's the first thing I try to clarify as a teacher, and I think everybody should clarify within themselves to be very certain that it's not the me who has awoken. Awakeness woke up from the me. Or I like to say sometimes, it's enlightenment that's enlightened. It's not the me that's enlightened. It's not the person that's enlightened. It's enlightenment is enlightened. That may be hard to understand until one experiences it for oneself. But of course, all of spirituality is like that. Everything must be verified for oneself and verified in oneself. But this phenomenon of I got it, I lost it, is very, very common. And if you think about it, it's the struggle, as it were, between our true nature and our imagined nature, our imagined sense of self, going back and forth. It means our consciousness hasn't quite got out of the gravitational field of the dream state of ego. And so often vacillates between the two, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. This can be very, very disconcerting. In some senses, it's almost a bit schizophrenic in a way. It's not true schizophrenia, of course, but it's a bit schizophrenic because once we've seen the deeper reality of things, and then we find ourselves back into the dream state, it's very odd because part of us knows the deeper reality. Part of us knows that the egoic structure isn't true. Part of us knows that whatever our mind believes, or whatever interpretation it's making, whatever our hang-up is, part of us knows it's not true. Part of us knows it's literally nothing but a dream in the mind and body. But simultaneously, the gravitational force of the dream state can still be very strong. So even as we know that, we can actually still be believing in ego. So it's very odd to be knowing that a thought within oneself absolutely has no validity, absolutely isn't true, and simultaneously believing that it is true. Before we awakened, we just believed a thought or we didn't believe a thought. That's all we knew. It was sort of one or the other. But after awakening, for a lot of people, after a glimpse of awakening, or what I call non-abiding awakening, it can be very strange, very disconcerting to believe and not believe simultaneously, or to act in a way that you know isn't actually coming from the undivided vision that you have seen. But you act that way anyway, and you're almost compelled by inner forces you don't understand to behave in a way that you know is not true. Now, there's many, many, many examples of this, but for those who have had these kind of experiences, I can only say that this is very common. It sounds very strange and it feels very, very confusing. And it feels for those people that they've made a great leap backwards, that they sort of de-evolved, that somehow they've made some terrible mistake, because how is it that you could be believing a thought and not believing a thought at the same time? How is it that you could be in a conversation with somebody and saying things that aren't really coming from the truth, that are actually coming from ego? But now you know where they're coming from and you know they're not true, but somehow you're saying them anyway. This is very disconcerting. And so a lot of people will assume somehow they've made a mistake, somehow something has gone terribly wrong. But what's important to know is nothing's gone wrong. No mistake has been made. It's just the next phase in one's awakening. It's the next unfolding. The truth of the matter is, it's very, very rare that someone's initial awakening ends up in abiding awakening, that kind of awakeness, that perception of one, that is abiding, which means is continuous, which doesn't go away, where the aperture doesn't close down. That's relatively rare. It happens, but not near as often as the other, which is where the awakening vacillates. Now, as I said before, some teachers would say, if the awakening vacillates, then it's not true awakening. I'm not one of them, for reasons that I've already described. Because if we've seen the truth, we've seen the truth. If we've seen it for 2 seconds or 2,000 years, it's the same truth, if we've seen the truth. And at that point, then we have to be able to deal with, in a wise way, what do we do at this particular phase where awakening literally vacillates, turns on and off by itself, like a light switch that somebody's turning on and off that you have no seemingly control over. But once you start to understand first that nothing's gone wrong, that this is just the next part of your journey, and as long as you run from this part of the journey, as long as you try to solve this dilemma by running back and finding that awake place, then you're actually avoiding this part of the journey. But once you realize there's no problem here, there may be still some confusion, and this vacillation at times can be painful. At times it can be very painful. In fact, it's much more painful to act in a way that we know is not true once we really know it's not true. Before we may have acted in ways that were based on untruth, but we didn't know it. We were totally in the dream state. As Jesus said, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Which is literally when we're in the dream state, we don't know what we are doing. We're simply acting in very programmed ways. But if we've really seen through the true nature of things, if reality within us is woken up, if spirit has opened its eye within us, now we know. There's a much more accurate sense of when we're moving or speaking or even thinking from truth and when we're not. And then when we go ahead and move from untruth anyway, it's much, much more painful than when we didn't know it was untrue. So the stakes go up. The more awake we get, the higher the stakes get. I remember staying at a monastery, a Buddhist monastery for a while that I visited, and the abbess there, this wonderful woman, talked about this process of awakening, and she said it's like climbing a ladder. With each step you go, you have less and less of a tendency to look down, which means you have less and less of a tendency to act in ways you know aren't true, or speak in ways you know aren't true, or do things that you know aren't coming from truth. Because if you do, you start to realize that the consequences that you experience become greater and greater and greater. And the more awake we get, the greater the consequences get. Until finally the consequences get so immense that even for the slightest movement or action or behavior that's not in accordance with the truth that we know, the consequences for us can become extraordinarily high. So this isn't something we count on in awakening. We think that freedom is just sort of just a get-out-of-jail-free card. Initially, we have a relationship with spiritual freedom that's actually quite infantile. That freedom is just a personal thing. That it's just about me feeling extraordinarily good and free. But it's much more nuanced than that. In one sense, it's complex but also simple. Freedom isn't just a personal thing. It's not an acquisition for us. As we become more conscious, more awake, there's also consequences to the awakening. There's consequences to everything. And what you find is when you move and behave in ways that are not in harmony with what you know to be true, the consequences get higher and higher. And so there are good reasons, or I should say there are reasons, why awakening vacillates. And most of those reasons have to do with unresolved conflicts within ourselves. They have to do with the remaining conditioning areas within ourselves that this awakening didn't penetrate through and so therefore couldn't become totally free from. This shouldn't be mistaken as a self-improvement plan, because it's not. This isn't a becoming a perfect being. This is about seeing through in oneself what causes division. It's very different than having a goal of a perfect person. Because an awakening enlightenment has nothing to do with one's image of a perfect person or a holy person or a saintly person. What's truly holy is a whole being, is perceiving from wholeness, which means that we as a human being are not divided inside. And it's that which divides us inside, which causes the literal physical experience of division within us. Whatever causes that experience of division, that's what needs to be healed, because that is contributing to us staying within the gravitational pull of the dream state.